Hello everyone, I'm Asha Nayaswami and we're continuing with Swami Kriyananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. So here we go. We're on in the book, in Swami's book, this chapter, which is chapter number 13, is called Why Fight? And it is chapter number 3 of the Gita, stanza number 3. Why fight becomes relevant as we go through this chapter, this particular stanza. It's interesting, some of the parts of this stanza have been in my mind for a long time, but I wasn't exactly sure where they were in the commentary. So it's an expanded theme, but it's also an extremely interesting one, so I hope you find it so by the time we're done with it. It's a very long commentary, but I think we'll probably be able to get through most of it. Here's what the stanza says. The Cosmic Lord said, O sinless one, at the beginning of creation, I established two means by which man could achieve salvation. The first was by wisdom, the other was by right action. So the chapter title, Why Fight, becomes relevant because we're talking about right action and what is right action. And in the context of the Gita, which you may remember or may not, so I'll just remind everyone, it's a conversation between the devotee Arjuna and the Lord in the form of Krishna, and it takes place in a chariot on a battlefield on the eve of battle, when Arjuna, after this tremendous story, which is the Mahabharata, and all this effort to avoid this final conflict with his own cousins for the rulership of the kingdom, Krishna's driving his chariot, Arjuna hesitates. He hesitates on the eve of battle. The entire Bhagavad Gita is the conversation about Arjuna's hesitation and what the Lord thinks about it. So the question is, why fight? Because Arjuna said, these are my cousins, these are the people that I love, the people that I grew up with. It would be a sin to go to battle with them and try to kill them. And of course the whole thing, as we've been talking about, is an allegory about our own inner struggle to master our limited qualities and to live by our expanded qualities. So he says, the first way is wisdom and the other way is right action. Now there are many, many, many interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita, and this stanza is certainly subject to many of them. So it's very, very interesting how Master explains it. He starts by saying true wisdom means one thing only, the perception of Brahman and oneness with him. Those who are blessed with this perception have no need for action at all. So most of the time when people start thinking about wisdom, that people translate wisdom and right action to being the path of Jnana Yoga or the path of Karma Yoga. Jnana Yoga would mean discrimination and understanding that the world is a dream and seeing through the dream, and Karma Yoga would be commonly interpreted to mean serving the world. So one could sort of see how these are seemingly like opposite ideas, because if one is concentrating on essentially transcending the world or dismissing the world because it's just a dream, then why would you dedicate yourself to serving it? So there's this apparent conflict created by these two realities. But the Gita actually, as subsequent stanzas also unfold, it talks about, and we'll get into this, that inaction is also an action, that you can't merely refrain from action, you have to transcend the necessity for action. And so this is how Master immediately defines this chapter. Wisdom is not having discrimination. Wisdom is the perception that the only reality is Brahma, to be in that state of awareness. Now, later on it says, the path to yoga through wisdom begins truly with the vision of God. As one saint put it, I used to think that when I achieved Nirvikalpa Samadhi, my work would be done. Instead, I discovered on reaching that state that my work had only just begun. Now, this is something that has fascinated me, not from direct experience, I assure you, but just from coming to a humble understanding of how how intellectual my understanding of spiritual life is compared to actually experiential. And it began for me when I was, I had this book that was given to me that was a translation of some of Lahiri Mahashaya's diaries. Lahiri Mahashaya, who was Yogananda's guru's guru, kept extensive diaries of his meditative experiences. Excuse me. But let me just get that straight for a minute. He kept extensive diaries of his meditative experiences, but they were done in Bengali. Thank you very much. My friend here noticed that I was dry. He was correct. Earlier today, I got the unexpected news that a very, very old friend had died. I haven't been in touch with a friend for years. But he was one of the people who was responsible for introducing me to Swami Kriyananda. And so just the realization that he's passed from this planet, he was probably 76, so it wasn't as if he didn't live a full term, but his passing was very unexpected. So I must confess, in the middle of this, and I'm saying this out loud so that I can get it out of my mind, half of my mind is back 45 years ago, just kind of living through all these other experiences, and half of me is trying to talk about the subject at hand. So having said that, now I think I can get back to where we were. So this diary, and I think I've mentioned this before, of Lahiri Mahashaya's was written in Bengali and hasn't really been widely published in the West, but some Bengali man wrote a book drawing from the diary. The book was a little frustrating because it was kind of a mix of the author's own ideas and Lahiri's ideas, and you couldn't really tell where they were, who was what. But the most interesting thing about it was that Lahiri did essentially no outward work. He didn't found an organization. He didn't do anything like that. He sat in his home in Varanasi and meditated. And the power of his spiritual presence drew probably thousands of people, perhaps even tens of thousands by the end. And he taught people Kriya, and then just launched this whole movement, of which Yogananda coming to America was, the next inevitable step. So Lahiri appeared to be doing no work, but in fact he was, from this diary, he was extremely busy exploring meditative realities. One of the fascinating things that was said about him, just said, Yogananda puts it in the autobiography, at the end of his life, Lahiri was, quote, working on a technique to liberate animals directly without their having to go through all the stages of human life. I haven't the foggiest idea what to do with a statement like that. Like, what could that possibly mean? But this is Lahiri's role as an avatar, just looking for ways to uplift the planet, but also just all these different explorations in the state of meditation. And simultaneously, or also as another example of that, Yogananda had an extensive correspondence with his most advanced male disciple, which is Rajarsi Janakananda, an American man named James J. Lynn. And in some of that correspondence, which alas has been preserved but not published, the person who had it in their hands did not give it to Ananda, which we had hoped they would, and we would have published it, but now it's mostly not available. But in any case, parts of it get out every once in a while. And Master would make suggestions to Rajarsi about various things he could try in his meditation. Now, Master said that Rajarsi was in a state of samadhi at all times, in a very high state of samadhi, but Master was giving him little things that he could do. Now, my own little mind somehow has this picture that when you get into a state of nirvikalpa samadhi, that somehow everything comes to an end. But if you think about it, souls are in nirvikalpa samadhi for long periods of time. Something must be going on. Not anything that I can imagine, but something. So now we get into this part of this commentary where, where Master defines what wisdom is. Wisdom is the perception of the infinite. Wisdom is seeing this world as a dream and realizing that Brahma is the only reality. And then your salvation begins, because that's what he talks a lot about here. He talks about once one has realized oneness with God and understood that in everything one does, God alone is the doer, he must still recall, and having recalled, release into the infinite all the deeds he performed in ego consciousness through the long succession of countless past lives. Now, I'd heard Swamiji talk about this before, and it becomes very interesting for several different reasons, but that once you see that you are one with God, there's this whole other stage. And Jivan Mukta is freed while living, but to become a Param Mukta, which is completely free, you have to also resolve everything that's behind you. I mean, now I'm going to make some little attempt, and I hope it will be successful. You'll have to evaluate it at the end. I'll just do my best here to try to bring this very high idea down to something that's also livable for us, because we can be intellectually fascinated by far out ideas, but the most helpful is if we can draw from that very high idea something that actually motivates us and empowers us in the present to move toward it. Otherwise, it's just theoretical. It's just intellectual. It's not really going to transform us. So here's this thing to think about. When you finally recognize your oneness with God, all of this is still behind you. All the times that you thought your ego was acting and identifying. And Master says here, and Swami says it in several other places, you have to go through all those incarnations, and you have to consciously recall. This is what he says: recall and then release. Now, in the life that I live right now, I am increasingly aware, in the last few years especially, fourth ashram stage of life probably, just aware of how not free I am. Now, I will simultaneously pair that with a glorious sense of how free I am, but a humble realization how free I am compared to when I was 30 is what I really mean by that the spiritual path does work. But I'm also appreciating how much of my response to life is often a reaction to life based on some predisposition of energy that is really not related to the present moment at all, but is just an inclination that I've carried from who knows when, an unforgiven betrayal, a desire, an unsatisfied desire for revenge, a remembered fulfillment that I have a nostalgia to re-experience, a mistake that still plagues me that I want to make right again. I was recently in a different context, in another context. I was consistently having an impatient reaction to certain events that were going on around me, and I became aware of the fact that I have very low tolerance for what I would call intellectual dishonesty. Now, of course, I'm the one sitting here making the judgment, but what I mean by that is deliberate false reasoning to win a predetermined point, where reason follows feeling. One wants something to be true, and then therefore one sees all the reasons why it is true, even if objective facts dismantle the argument. Now, I was a debater for a couple of years. In my first 2 years of high school, I was on the debate team, and of course, that's what you're trained to do. You're trained to dismantle with facts other people's false reasoning. But of course, the reason I was drawn to debate is because that is something that is important to me. Now, of course, it's a positive spiritual quality if it's elevated to the level of wisdom. But in this context, what it is that I become quite upset. I feel it's like a moral outrage to me if someone deliberately uses false reasoning. And that is a reaction. Why? For what reason? What incarnations? Obviously, with the temperament I have, I must have been a politician and a revolutionary a lot. A psychic lady, who is probably right, said that I helped to start the French Revolution. I don't know whether I did or not. It's apocryphal. And I know one of the reasons, I'll use the word I am privileged rather than cursed, to have to do as much explanation of the self-realization teachings is, and this is what this psychic lady also said, is because I brought a lot of people to false teachings. And so now that I feel I really have found Sanatana Dharma and the true path to fulfillment, I have to keep talking and talking and talking until I've balanced all that karma. So I'm just talking about reincarnation. I'm talking about the influence of past lives. But before we can absolutely be free, and you see, there's this point of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and believe me, I'm just making this up, but this is what I'm told. Making it up meaning this is not experience. I'm way beyond my portfolio. But one perceives the dream nature of life and recognizes that ego is a delusion. But apparently, the memory of having thought you were an ego and acting from that ego still binds you until you consciously release it. Now, as Swamiji says in the commentary, it's not like you have to, I mean, think about it. You don't have to just go inch by inch and day by day over bazillions of years. He says you can, he uses the phrase, in one deep meditation, you can kind of wash an incarnation away with a superconscious awareness that no matter what happened, God was the doer. But for some reason that I don't understand, you still have to recall and release all those incarnations and see that God was the doer in all of it. Now, from the point of view, as I started, of the life that I'm living, I've always followed a policy as best I've been able, and it was put into a marvelous little acronym. Acronym? Is that the word? When you make a word out of the first letter of things. I hope acronym is the word. Somehow that sounds wrong, but it doesn't matter. He made the acronym SPY-DOG. And it means solving problems in direction of God. And what that meant, and SPY-DOG has been a very positive part of my life ever since he said that about 1971, so that's been a really long time. If you have something that's troubling you, whatever it might be, whatever it is that is disturbing your equanimity, whether it's a minor or a major disturbance, you can solve it on its own level. You can feel, tense, and so you can take a tranquilizer. You can feel bored, so you can go to sleep. You can feel angry, and you can tear apart some part of your house. You can smash all sorts of things. But those may alleviate the immediate anxiety, but they haven't taken you anywhere that you're really trying to go. It's a horizontal solution like this. SPY-DOG is always try to resolve whatever is disturbing your equanimity by lifting your energy up to a higher plane of existence. So the Jivan Mukta's assignment, which is to recall and release, recognizing that ego consciousness itself is a delusion, and therefore everything that happened was just the power of God acting through us, that we were never a separate individuality in any circumstance. That even, as Swami says in here, the villainous things that we do, even the villainous things that we do, have been a necessary part of the plot, because the villainous things that we do give us the experience of the consequences of wrong action. And unless we experience the consequences of our wrong action, we never know that those actions are wrong, because what makes an action wrong is not some, arbitrary pronouncement from some higher source. What makes an action wrong is that we suffer from it. And we don't suffer because someone's cursing us. We suffer because that's the way we're made. If I had a lit candle and there's a flame and I put my hand in the flame, it's going to burn and it's going to hurt. But it's not the flame's fault. The flame is not like singling me out and trying to hurt me. It's the way I'm made, the way the human body is made. If you put flesh against flame, then the flesh will be the sufferer. And so in our lives, we are actually literally impelled by God. And this is where you end up with this strange realization that people intellectualize and simply can't sort out. The strange realization that even Satan must be an instrument of God. Because if we didn't have these wrong experiences that cause us to suffer, then we wouldn't understand, we wouldn't know how to discern what right experiences are. Now, I can hear all the objections that immediately come up, but sometimes innocent people are made to suffer. That's where it gets really dicey. That's where the law of karma is a hard pill to swallow sometime, because there's a magnetic truth to all of the cosmos, and no one finds themselves in any situation except that the magnetic force of their own karma drew them to it. Now we also have to recognize, and that either, nobody likes to hear this, either we're being punished for a past mistake, or we're being given an extraordinary opportunity to face into seemingly insurmountable obstacles and to transcend it by the wisdom of God. And regardless of whatever gets us into it, that is always the question. Now that I'm suffering, what will get me out of this suffering? It was a very interesting experience we had once. There's a man named Richard Wurmbrand. Richard Wurmbrand was born Jewish, converted to Christianity. He lived in Romania. I'm sure he's off the planet now. He lived in Romania. He was an adult during the Second World War. And then when he was a Jew and Nazis came into Romania, he was persecuted as a Jew. Then, even though he had converted to Christianity, he was still persecuted as a Jew. Then he lived through that, and then the communists came in, and then the communists took a stand against religion. So then he was persecuted as a Christian, and really persecuted. Put into prison and tortured, and years in prison. He actually wrote a magnificent, although hard to read book called Tortured for Christ. If you are inspired by those kinds of stories, definitely look up both Richard Wurmbrand and his wife, Sabina Wurmbrand, who wrote her own book called The Pastor's Wife. She too was imprisoned, not for as long and not as severely as he was, but plenty. It was plenty. I'll just tell you this story because I'm here. Let's see. When the communists came into Romania, and I don't know the full history, but they came in and they gradually began oppressing religion, really crushing it. The communists didn't believe in religion, and it was a force they couldn't control, so they really were crushing it. And they were beginning to install their own so-called priests and just making a mockery, so that the churches were state-controlled and the priests were just government agents. They weren't really true Christians. So there was some kind of a big public meeting, and the government so-called priests are sort of acting out some kind of a charade of piety. And Sabina's sitting next to her husband, Richard, and they are deep and true Christians. And she says to him, somebody must wipe this stain off the face of Jesus. Meaning somebody has to stand up to this horrible thing that's happening. And he turns to her and he says, if I stand up now, you will no longer have a husband. Meaning, I will be arrested, perhaps killed, taken from you. She says, if you do not, I will no longer have a husband. My God, I only pray that I would have such courage in such a moment. So he stands up and he denounces what they're doing. And then soon after he's taken away. And then later, eventually she's taken away and their son is taken away. All of them survived and became magnificent from the experience. So I come back to where I was starting to say, so many years later, eventually they were ransomed out of the communist country, ransomed to America. And sometime in the 70s, Swami knew about him and we were all very inspired by their stories. he came to speak in a church in Grass Valley. We all lived at Ananda Village then. That was one of the nearest town. So he came to speak. It was really quite fun because for some reason that church was set up in such a way that, like the sanctuary and the fellowship hall, there was kind of like a dais, a portico, and the person could either be speaking to the sanctuary or he could turn around and he could speak to the fellowship hall. Ananda had come in such a large number that they put us all in the fellowship hall because the sanctuary was filled with on the other side. So the theology of Richard Wurmbrand was actually rather narrow. I mean, the stated theology of the church he represented was rather narrow. Jesus Christ is our only Savior and so on. But of course, Wurmbrand's experience of Jesus so far transcended his theology. His was direct experience, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So Richard Wurmbrand is here, and as he spoke, he kind of would turn back and forth from one side to the other. He would turn toward the sanctuary, where it was mostly the people of his church denomination, and he would talk to them in their theology. And then he would turn back to us, and he would start talking about, the formless Christ and the mystical experience and the true nature of communion. And then he would turn back, and he would sort of talk their theology, and we just sort of watched him like this. And somehow he saw Swami, and they must have recognized each other. And Swami we were all in our 20s, and Swami was older, so it looked like the father of the family. And at some point, Richard stopped. And he said to Swamiji, whom he must have recognized, he said, "Is it a rule in your community that only women who are beautiful are allowed to move there?" And Swamiji smiled and said, "No," he said, "what it is that after they begin to live the life at Ananda, they become beautiful." It was just so sweet between them. Then there was another man. This was the point. There was another man there that evening who had had the same experience that Richard had had. Richard was magnificent. He was so large and beautiful and full of light. This other man was small and broken and bitter. Same experience. So, was Richard blessed and this man cursed? Was both of their experiences a curse? It was entirely a question of what they made of their situation. Spy dog, solving problems in direction of God. Richard Wurmbrand in his book, I'm going on a long tangent here, but it's so inspiring. In his book, Tortured for Christ, he tells this story about, you can't even get your mind. It's hard to get one's mind around these things, how human beings could treat each other this way, but they do. The guards were just keeping Richard up for hours and hours, refusing to allow him to sleep and making him walk around his cell, 4 steps this way, 3 steps this way, 4 steps this way, 3 steps this way, just like this. And Richard said he felt himself, feeling he couldn't go on. He felt himself becoming angry at those who were making him do this, just went through all these different experiences. And then finally this thought came to him. He said, could this be happening outside the will of God? And when he suddenly realized that it was Jesus himself who was asking him to walk, otherwise he wouldn't have been asked to walk. He said he became so ecstatic that, everything disappeared except this ecstatic state of being in the presence of God and following the will of God. And then I don't remember exactly how it ended, but he just said he could have walked forever. Everything else disappeared from him because it was all God acting through him. So that is a very tangible example of exactly what's being happened here, where we have to recall and then release. Because everything that happened to us and everything we did, how could it be happening outside the will of God? It's an extremely challenging question. The way I've found it working in my life, this is just how I managed to try to integrate many levels, and maybe it'll work for you. It's one thing, a friend of mine was talking about a mutual friend was sick in the hospital and had some sudden serious ailment, and she was very angry. Why is this happening to me? Why me? Why is this happening to me? And the other friend said, why not you? Which was just like, yeah, why not you? It's just the ego that says, not me, but why not you? Just because we don't want it, everything that happens is happening because it's a necessary step to take us to the divine. So we don't have to be without suffering to be able to be accepting a test and passing it. I mean, but where we fall down is if we feel like somebody is doing something to us, and whatever is being done to us is somehow outside the will of God, even if we don't like the will of God. And that's where Jesus' prayer comes in. Jesus, before he was crucified, he said, Lord, let this cup pass from me. I love that prayer, because there he was. He thought maybe something better could happen than just being crucified. He wasn't worried about being crucified, but he was hoping that the people he had come to help would recognize that he had come to help them, and therefore they wouldn't crucify him, because the pain of his heart was for their lack of comprehension, not for the loss of his physical body, which was of no consequence to him. His body was just his body. It was his consciousness that mattered. Bodies come and go. He could shed it or keep it. It didn't matter. As Master said, once you've eaten dinner off the wisdom plate of the body, you can either keep it or throw it away, and it makes no difference to you. And wisdom is the pure perception of God, which Jesus had. But Jesus made that prayer, Lord, I can think of a better plan than this one. But then he said, but thy will, not mine, be done. So this is the balancing in the present moment, that this is happening to me. Maybe I love it. Maybe this is just wonderful. Maybe it's very painful. But whatever it is, thy will be done. So we can even say, I'm not pleased with this, sir, which I have said on many occasions. I'm not pleased with this, sir. I know you're behind it, and I don't like it. And I just want you to know I have registered my disapproval. But I know that everything is for my ultimate good, and therefore we have to accept it in that way. Now that's a huge freedom. Even if we can't rise all the way to bliss, we can at least recognize that it's just the power of God running through me. It's just the power of God acting with me. So this is what he's talking about in the Jivan Mukta stage, in the Nirvikalpi stage. We still have to release it all. So there's just many, many levels. And we might as well get started now. They say one of the things you can do that's very helpful to people when they're near death is you can just start their life review. I mean, if people are conscious, not in the last moments. But just start talking to people about their lives. Because as soon as we pass over from this life, we're going to have to review our life. So we might as well get a head start on it. Just get started and begin to release, to begin to recall and release. Recall and release, recall and release. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, to get as free as we can, without the absolute wisdom of recognizing that we are one with God. We are able to release less, but nonetheless we can keep on with it. I remember I had a conflict with one of my Guru Bhais, and it was a long-standing karmic conflict, and that at one point we both had a past lives revealed to us that justified our distrust and dislike of each other in spades. And that, instead of freeing us from our antipathy, it was hardening each of us in our position. And it's comical now, but it was not at all funny at the time. It was really so not funny. But Swamiji got us together, and he acknowledged that probably our memories were true. But then he said so simply, but neither of you would do that anymore. You've both learned your lesson. Oh, yeah, that's right. So it's not just a question of recalling, it's also releasing. So I often hear people tell me, well, the reason I'm this way is because, I suffered in that way, and so imprisoned me, and I was married to this one, and they mistreated me terribly, or this baby died, or that. I mean, just all these different things, which help. It helps. At least it helps me. Sometimes if I don't know for real, I'll imagine what circumstance could produce this result. And even if the story is only apocryphal, it helps me to recognize that what I'm relating to is in the past and not in the present. I put names to my feelings, and that honors my feelings, but it also separates them from the fact that all he did was offer me a cup of coffee, and I read into it, the lifetime in which he poisoned me and my whole family, and all he really did was offer me a cup of coffee. And you just kind of have to get it all apart. But sometimes I hear people talk about their past lives and what they then do. They have recalled, but they've not released. And in fact, they're clinging. That's why I feel this way. No, it's just the opposite. Oh, that's why I feel this way. But it's not happening now. We have to move upward. We have to just simply let it go. Easier said than done. But as long as we know that's where we're going, I make this distinction in my life between those actions I commit and those actions I am committed to. And there's a huge difference, because many times I commit actions, but then I realize that I do not want to be committed to that kind of action. I recognize that this was a goof, and I put my hand into the fire and my finger got burned. Note to self, don't do that again, because I don't enjoy being burned. And so the thing to do is to keep your finger out of the fire. Very, very good idea. That's why God keeps doing this to us. Richard Wurmbrand, who knows? But perhaps, one can imagine, maybe many lifetimes ago he didn't have the courage to stand up for his beliefs. And maybe he felt deeply and profoundly ashamed of himself for a very long time for not having the courage of his beliefs. So he comes right back around to the opportunity where he gets to have the courage of his beliefs. And he steps right into that with all that power. And, then you resolve all that, whatever it was. I mean, certainly a man of that much courage had to learn to be that courageous. So for a fact that he must have started and stopped and stumbled more than once before he was able to come through as heroically as he did in this lifetime. You see, it's all how you look at it. If you realize that this is just a university, and it's not an end in itself, it's just a place in which we learn what we need to actually be, what we're meant to be, which is one with the infinite, then the whole story begins to look, very different than it looked otherwise. Now, let me just see where else we have here. Other aspects about Jivan Mukta which are very interesting just in and of themselves, I find this interesting at least. But Jivan Mukta is completely free. There is no post of ego. The ego has been dissolved, so no new karma is created. But Swami asked Master, once you reach the stage of Jivan Mukta where the sense of ego has been dissolved, Swami asked him, how long does one remain a Jivan Mukta before he becomes Param Mukta, which is completely free? Master said, interestingly, he said, in that state of freedom, you don't care. He said, sometimes rather than finishing the project of recalling and releasing those lifetimes, he said, you just let that unfinished karma, it's not unfinished karma in quite the same way that we would think of unfinished karma, because there's no more lessons to be learned. Unfinished karma means, for most of us, that there's something that we haven't yet learned about action, reaction, about suffering created from acting other than in our highest interest. The Jivan Mukta is free. He has the wisdom to know that everything is God. There's no ego self anymore. But for reasons I don't understand, but is expressed here, that understanding has to be applied back to previous incarnations. This is, as I say, I'm so far beyond my portfolio, I don't understand. But he says that the Jivan Mukta can just leave that karma there for a long time, because it will be the vehicle, the reason that will continue to draw him back to the world And he'll do that in order to help others, because he's free himself and his compassion will bring him back. Now, I have to say, and it might be obvious, that one of the reasons I'm so interested in this is because it was my perception, and this is me just expressing myself, I feel that is the only explanation for the life of Swami Kriyananda. Master said he would attain final liberation at the end of the incarnation as Kriyananda, which from my very limited understanding tells me he must have been a Jivan Mukta. At least, presumably he was born a Jivan Mukta, because it seems to me like that karma would run for a while before you become totally free. I'm only speculating. But because so many things happened in Swami Kriyananda's life, so many sort of different issues arose and different adventures. I've just finished, well, I finished it last summer, but now it's about to be published, this very big book of all my years of Swami Kriyananda. And during the whole time, I've really tried to understand who is he and what is he doing. But this idea of letting the karma just finish itself, and he said various things to me. I put this in the book. He referred to the very difficult karma he had with SRF and being expelled from SRF and so on. I'm not going to spoil the whole plot by telling you everything. But at one point he said basically it was karma that he saved it. He saved the karma for when it would be useful. That's how he put it. And there's a lot more to that than what I just said. But that comment brought me right to this section of this book, thinking, that the karma eventually had to finish, had to sort of be lived through again, but it was there just to serve others, because it was a very important karma that had to be gone through. And the way Swamiji can write and so confidently about these different states, I don't know. But having no ego, no post of ego to which things can cling, and yet still just letting the life experience unfold, I'm not really quite sure. But that's how I came to understand him. So every time I read anything about the state of Jivan Mukta, I get very interested. Now, what Master also says is that the Jivan Mukta can dissolve, can let the karma run, or he can dissolve it whenever he chooses. And he can simply say, he says, or you may say simply, I am free, and then you will be free in God forever. Now this slightly contradicts that you have to recall and release, and I can't reconcile it. But nonetheless, that's how he says it. Now, there was a further conversation when Swami reported this exchange with Master, when one of the disciples said, but sir, if I just said I was free, I wouldn't be free, would I? And Master responds by saying, well, you've already answered your own question. You already said you wouldn't. So what he goes on to explain is, most of the time when we say free, when we say I, it's just whatever our intellect is saying, our reality is I means the ego. And so when we say I am free, but everything in us, our actual perception of reality is that I am a separate ego, well, the ego is not free. So the only way that one can declare I am free is if that I has become like the I, like the pronoun I when Jesus used it. Much of the entire confusion and different interpretations of the Bible are that single pronoun. Because people presume when Jesus said I, he meant the physical body he was living in, but the ego is the infinite identified with the physical body. And we all have egos, we identify with the physical body. And even if I want to say I, the infinite, there's no part of me that is actually at the level of wisdom where I can see God when I say I. When I say I think of my childhood, I think of my present life, I think of my middle life, I think of what I'm going to have for dinner. I mean, there's just all this I in it that is not I, the infinite spirit. But when that ego identification dissolves, then all karma can be dissolved with it. And to bring it back to where we are, I mean, that's where we are, where I am in evolution. I mean, that's what we try to understand. Why am I identifying with this? Why am I personalizing this experience? Why am I reacting? Let me at least affirm, even if it's not my actual perception, that this is happening, but why do I have to feel like it's happening to me? I heard a beautiful statement about an advanced spiritual teacher who had some karma, and there was a chaos in his ashram, and he ended up actually having to leave his own ashram. And the man who took him in to take care of him remarked afterwards that it was really exhilarating, uplifting spiritually, to watch this very advanced soul deal with this karmic chaos in his life. And he said the man felt it wasn't as if the guru man was going through a hard time. It was that a hard time was going through him. And that's such an interesting way to look at it. The karma has to express itself. The karma is being finished. The karma is being relived, recalled. I don't know what to say. I don't know what the right words are. But it's going through me. It isn't me. It's just going through me. And that would be, you can release it even as it's happening. Where it stays with us is when I suffer. Why am I suffering? I wish I weren't suffering. He's making me suffer. She's making me suffer. I will get my revenge. And then the whole world closes in on this little experience. Now, the way to think about this so that it becomes transcendence and not merely suppression is to think of it like this. If you have a black dot and you put it right up against your eye, then everything that you see is a black dot. If you take that same black dot and put it even at arm's length from you and look at it, you will also be conscious that there is a bigger field around that dot. Here, all you see is it. Here, you see it, and it hasn't changed. It's the same size, it's the same dark, it's the same everything. But when you look at it from a different perspective, it stands in a context. And so that's what the recalling and releasing of past life karma, there it is. And maybe if you were murdered by your best friend, or you murdered your best friend, or you lost all your money, or you were abandoned by your parents, or you were born a cripple and had to go through terrible suffering, all of that, it's the same size and the same color. But when you're living it here, it's quite different than when you're living it here. Here is because it now has context. And it is partly the passage of time, but it isn't only the passage of time. It's also the self-definition that's around it. If this is your entire self-definition, then everything that happens connected to this just overwhelms you. If your self-definition includes a bigger reality, then even if this smaller entity is being battered to pieces, it's being battered to pieces on the ocean of spirit, rather than having reality reduced to this point. And of course, what happens to us when we suffer is that reality is reduced to our suffering. There is no past, there is no future. There's just this horrible moment, and we feel it's going to last forever. Swamiji said one of the reasons that they talk about hell being eternal is because when you're in it, it feels like it is, which is pretty exactly true. That's one of the strange things, and these are bewildering issues to me. These are not things that I can really even understand, but that grief dissipates over time. And I've seen grief dissipate over time, and I've tried to understand why grief dissipates over time. Partly it becomes context. One has other experiences, and even that heart-wrenching, whatever it might be, is now, it's overlaid, it's been overlaid by more recent experiences. So it becomes a little distant from us. Is it actually dissipated, or is it weakened only by time? I honestly can't answer those questions. They concern me because I've experienced enough of unresolved grief from lifetimes I don't even remember, that everything that has grieved me in this life, I don't want to see it again. I want to genuinely release it. And so these are all just, I'm musing with you. I'm not able to give you solid answers. Pick up chapter 3, stanza 3, and you can read this through and draw some of your own conclusions from it. It's very interesting. So, let's see. Let me just see. There's a whole lot more in here, but Master also comments, that the intellect, just being intellectual is not being wise, and he emphasizes the point that the wisdom Krishna was speaking of is the direct perception of oneness with God, not merely the idea of it. And he also goes on to say that that experience comes from expanding your consciousness sufficiently to be able to hold it. He calls it the liberating shock of omnipresence. There's stories told about certain disciples of Master who were badgering Master to give them an experience of samadhi. But Master said, you couldn't take it. You simply couldn't take it. Rajasi made a comment to a disciple who was badgering him as well. He said, if you had an experience of samadhi and then had to come back to the way you are, you wouldn't be able to bear your life anymore. So we have to grow into these things stage by stage by stage, which is part of all the tumult of everyday life, is that if we respond to it correctly, we keep expanding our capacity to see the divine in the context of everything. And there is, a quantum shift, a total shift of reality, but also we glimpse it. We see the chains of ego, if not breaking, at least loosening. And we sort of watch ourselves. This is the most wonderful thing about being on the spiritual path for a while. One just watches how we just react differently. Something that would have just completely discombobulated us might shake us up for a little while, but then we recover, because our very sense of self has shifted into something else, so that which used to consume our sense of self now happens and glances off of it because we're so different. It's a wonderful part of it. Now, just to finish go back, I've been talking a lot about the wisdom side of it, but this stanza also says, that there's two ways. One is wisdom and one is right action. And Master makes a point of saying that right action isn't just anything, not random. He said right action is the systematic practice of those things that will gradually dissolve the ego sense of I. And he says the practice of yoga and the yogic techniques. But then he goes on to say that it's not the Hindu practice or anything like that. In Patanjali's eightfold path to divine union is not a religion. It's a description of the experiences that a person has. And we start with the yamas and niyamas, which is right and moral action. Then we talk about asana, which is the capacity to firm posture is what asana means. But what that means is the capacity to liberate the concentration and the consciousness from the demands of the body. That we're able to anchor the body so that it's not a distraction to the expanding consciousness. And then we go into pranayama, which is to be able to control the energy in our body. We go to dharana, which is one-pointed concentration. We go to dhyan, which is absorption in what we are concentrating on. And then we come into the state of samadhi, which is oneness with the infinite. Now, those are not tenets of a religion. Those are what happens to us when we begin to follow the path of right action. As Krishna says it, wisdom is the perception of our oneness with God. Right action is how we come to that perception. We first have to have right behavior, which is what the yamas and the niyamas are. They're the so-called 10 commandments of yoga, just right behavior. Then, anchor ourselves so that we can concentrate. The advantage of yoga, he said quite simply, is, Master says here quite simply, is that it's systematic, it's classical. Kriya Yoga, which is what Master brought to America, specific techniques of yoga, is like a specific course of right action which will lead us to salvation. So if one is not already in a state of wisdom, which is to say, perceiving our oneness with the infinite, then it behooves us to take up a right practice. When Master came to America with the practice of Kriya Yoga, he says this in Autobiography of a Yogi, Kriya Yoga is designed to bring the whole world into a new age. Now, and he said self-realization has come to unite all religions. So if you're thinking Kali Yuga, you think, oh boy, Catholic Church is finished, self-realization church is going to be the next one. It's ironic because here in Palo Alto, we bought a Catholic church and turned it into a self-realization church, which is sort of fun because the Catholic Church in the West has been the sort of dominant institution. So it turned over to its next stage. But self-realization is not a religion. Self-realization is not an institution. Self-realization is wisdom. It's the path. It's knowing who we actually are. And Kriya Yoga is the right action that will bring us to that state of awareness. And when you're absorbed in the infinite, when you're in one-pointed concentration on your own divine reality, the very idea of theology, religion, institutions, it has no bearing whatsoever. I mean, all of those outward definitions, what Master meant by self-realization is the actual experience of our inner reality is the unifying truth. And therefore, everyone will see that all true religions, if we love Jesus, if we like to do puja, if we're devoted to the practices of Buddhism, but eventually we will come to right action through the yamas and the niyamas. We will have firm posture. We will learn to control our energy. We will concentrate. We will become absorbed, because that's what you do. And once you become absorbed, the Master says here, some religions try to say that, our self-realized guru was more self-realized than your self-realized guru. Master says, it's just not possible. Everything becomes one. It's well-meaning, but, Jesus Christ, in an attempt to be devoted to him, they had to just make him more and more important. But the truth is, as Master said, the closer you are to the ocean, not the farther the wave stands above the ocean. We have it reversed. We think the more the wave distinguishes itself, the more important it is. But the fact of the matter is, the more the wave expresses the whole ocean, that's the reality that we're all working with. I mean, it's really absolutely a beautiful teaching. And it's also, right action, as Swami said, it's not just, this verse of the Gita is not just for serious practitioners of meditative science. He said it's setting the direction. That's why I've been trying to take these rather esoteric teachings and bring them into something that I can relate to. Recall and release is just a very wonderful idea that if I can practice today. I don't have to wait until I'm a Jivan Mukta and then have to overcome my identification with this. I can solve even my little problems in the direction of God. But he also says, the whole path of right action and the whole path of Patanjali and Kriya Yoga and everything, he said, is to take people progressively toward their final fulfillment. And he talks about first we come to just simple worldly happiness and pleasure. Then that happiness gets deeper and we can call it joy because it's less dependent on circumstances and more who we are. And then that joy becomes refined until it's infinite bliss. And all of us, in whatever reality we're living in, this is the progression that we're trying to go through. Just what will first, where is my happiness? How can I interiorize my happiness so it becomes joy? And then how can I remove all conditions from my joy so that it becomes infinite? And the wonderful thing about all these teachings is that will come. Just as like that. Swami tells this very touching story of when he was in Los Angeles and not many men wore beards at that time. And Master had him grow a beard so that he would look a little less youthful, a little more dignified. And because he had a beard, he was invited to be part of a tableau for a Masonic lodge where they were just having a tableau and they wanted somebody who looked like Jesus. So Swami sort of sat there praying at the rock looking like Jesus. And afterwards, Master said, how did it go? And Swami said rather in a joking way, well, he said, I'd much rather be like Jesus than merely look like him. And he said Master's response was so touching, because Master just very casually said, oh, that will come, that will come. That will come. That's all of us. That will come. And when it does come, everything else dissolves. All time, all space, all suffering. And that is simply who we are. Isn't that a joyful promise? Isn't that something worth striving for? God bless you.